She said she speaks 9 languages. He laughed, until she answered him in every single one. Excuse me, did you just say 9 languages? The man's voice cut through the room like someone snapping a pencil in half. Heads turned, glasses of champagne stopped halfway to lips. A dozen conversations in the ballroom of the Hyatt Regency in Dallas, Texas, suddenly broke off, as if the air itself had shifted. Nia Caldwell stood near the back, close enough to the service doors where the staff came in and out with trays. She wasn't dressed in glitter or diamonds like most of the people there. No sequined gowns, no tailored tuxedo. Just a simple navy dress that fell just below her knees, a pair of comfortable flats, and the small notebook she always carried. She looked more like an intern than a guest, which is exactly why most people ignored her. Until now. Yes, she answered calmly. 9. Her voice was steady, but her hands inside the notebook were tight, her pen pressed so hard against the paper that a small dent had formed in the margin. She hated moments like this, not because she didn't believe in herself, but because she knew exactly how the room would react. And right on cue, Richard Hallstrom, tech millionaire, keynote speaker, and the man whose name was plastered all over the event banners, let out a short laugh. Not the kind of laugh that fills a room with warmth, but the sharp, dismissive kind that carried just enough arrogance to make people around him chuckle too, even if they weren't sure why. 9 languages, he repeated, shaking his head as though she had told him she could fly. Come on, nobody just picks up 9 languages. Some of the men standing near him smirked. A few women exchanged looks that said, "Here we go again." To them, this was entertainment. A young woman, barely in her mid-20s, standing in front of a man worth hundreds of millions, claiming she could do something most scholars couldn't. But Nia didn't flinch. She lifted her chin ever so slightly, just enough to show she wasn't joking. Her eyes, a deep brown that had always carried a certain steadiness, locked on Richard. "You're welcome to test me," she said softly, almost invitingly. For a moment, Richard looked at her like she was a puzzle piece jammed into the wrong box. The people around him laughed again, not because of her words, but because they didn't believe she could back them up. It felt like a challenge in a circus act, something to pass the time before the next round of drinks arrived. But inside, Nia felt the same quiet fire she'd carried since she was a teenager. She had worked for this. She had sacrificed hours, weekends, and even friends to reach a level of mastery that no one could casually dismiss. Yet here she was, once again standing in a room full of people who thought brilliance had a look, a color, a certain type of resume attached to it. Richard didn't know her story yet. He didn't know the late nights in her mother's tiny kitchen in Phoenix, Arizona, with language tapes borrowed from the library. He didn't know about the notebook filled with translations she carried everywhere, or the way she taught herself new words every bus ride to community college. To him, she was just another guest with a wild claim. "All right then," he said finally, smirking as he stepped closer, his voice louder now, meant for the audience that had gathered. "Let's see, French." He switched into fluent French, asking her what brought her to the event. Without missing a beat, Nia answered him. In French so clear, so natural, that even the 1 or 2 native speakers nearby raised their brows. But Richard wasn't done. He moved into Mandarin, then Russian, then Arabic. Each time the crowd leaned in like gamblers, waiting to see if she would slip. And each time she responded with a calm fluency that left no room for doubt. The laughter faded, the smiles disappeared. By the time she answered him in flawless Arabic, the room had gone silent. Richard's smirk fell. His body stiffened, and for the first time that night, the millionaire who thought he'd seen it all looked genuinely caught off guard. But the real story hadn't even begun yet. Because what started as a casual dismissal in a hotel ballroom was about to turn into something far more personal, far more raw, and far more revealing than anyone expected. But while the crowd's silence was loud, Richard's next move would decide whether this night ended in humiliation for Nia or in a shock that no one in Dallas would forget. Long before she was standing in a ballroom in Dallas, Nia Caldwell was just a kid with a beat-up CD player and a stack of scratched language tapes from the Phoenix Public Library. Her mother, Denise, worked double shifts as a nurse at St. Joseph's Hospital. Her father had left when she was 8, and with no siblings, most of Nia's afternoons were spent alone in their small 2-bedroom apartment off Van Buren Street. She could still remember the way the desert heat baked through the windows while she sat at the kitchen table, headphones pressed tight, scribbling sounds she barely understood onto scraps of paper. Spanish came first, because in Phoenix, Spanish was everywhere. The bus rides, the grocery store checkout lines, the conversations in the hallways at school. To Nia, it wasn't just another language. It was a key to doors she didn't even know existed yet. But once Spanish clicked, she was hungry for more. She borrowed French tapes, then German, then Mandarin. By the time she was 16, her notebooks were stacked so high that her mom worried they'd collapse off the counter. "You don't get tired of this?" her mom asked once, wiping down the kitchen after a graveyard shift. "No," Nia said simply, without looking up. "It feels like every new word makes the world bigger." Denise had smiled faintly, though her eyes carried that heavy worry only mothers know. Bigger worlds were good, but they also meant risks, new places, people who might not understand her daughter's brilliance. School was tricky. Some teachers praised her when she rattled off phrases in other languages. Others rolled their eyes, assuming she was showing off. Kids in the hallway mocked her little nerd obsession, and once, a group of boys asked her to say something funny in Chinese, like she was a sideshow act. Still, Nia pressed on. At night, while her mom rested between shifts, she'd balance her notebook on the couch and flip through dictionaries she'd found at thrift stores. The walls of that apartment became her classroom, plastered with sticky notes in Arabic, Russian, and Italian. When she finally got into community college, money was tight. She couldn't afford every textbook, so she struck deals with students who had them. She'd tutor in exchange for borrowing their books overnight. Some nights, she barely slept, her eyes burning from endless repetitions of verb charts and pronunciation drills. By 21, she was fluent in more languages than most professors. By 23, she had been invited to small translation gigs in Phoenix, court hearings, hospital visits, even a wedding where the bride's family spoke Farsi and the groom's spoke Spanish. Nia stood at the center, moving between both sides seamlessly, and for the first time, she felt powerful. Not because of money or status, but because she was the bridge holding people together. But Phoenix had its limits. The paychecks were small, and no matter how many clients praised her, there was always someone who doubted. At a legal hearing once, a lawyer asked her mid-session, "Are you sure you got that right? You look too young to know this stuff." The sting stayed with her. Not because she was wrong, she wasn't, but because people like him never expected someone like her to carry that kind of skill. So when she heard about the networking event in Dallas, a gathering of business leaders, entrepreneurs, and investors, she saw an opening. They needed a translator for international guests, someone versatile, quick, and precise. Nia applied without expecting much. To her surprise, she was invited. That's how she ended up in the Hyatt Regency ballroom, holding that same worn notebook, walking among people who saw her as invisible until she opened her mouth. And when Richard Hallstrom, with his slick gray suit and sharper tongue, laughed at her claim of 9 languages, she wasn't shocked. She had seen that reaction 1,000 times before, just never on a stage this big. But what Richard didn't know was that every word she spoke tonight carried the weight of years of sacrifice, and she wasn't about to let anyone reduce her to a joke. The Hyatt Regency's ballroom was dressed like a stage for royalty. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across polished marble floors, and the air smelled faintly of expensive perfume mixed with the tang of white wine. Guests drifted between tables topped with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres, tiny shrimp skewers, stuffed mushrooms, and bite-sized eclairs that looked too perfect to eat. Nia arrived early, notebook in hand, her dress pressed carefully, though it was second-hand. She had saved it for months, knowing that in places like this, appearances mattered more than most people admitted. Still, when she walked through the revolving glass doors, she felt the weight of eyes. Most slid past her, as if she were just another hotel staff member who had taken a wrong turn. She made her way to the registration desk, where a woman with a headset and clipboard scanned her name tag. The pause was longer than necessary. "You're with translation?" the woman asked, her tone polite but clipped, like she hadn't expected someone like Nia to show up. "Yes," Nia replied evenly. The woman gave a quick nod, scribbled something on the paper, and motioned toward the far side of the room. "Staff and service personnel usually wait near the side doors. They'll let you know when you're needed." The word staff wasn't meant to insult, but it sat heavy in the air. Nia thanked her anyway and stepped aside, clutching her notebook a little tighter. She wasn't here to be served champagne or shake hands with investors. She was here to work, to prove herself. The ballroom filled fast, men in pressed suits with polished shoes, women draped in gowns that shimmered beneath the chandeliers, voices overlapped in English, French, Mandarin, German. Some guests shifted between tongues effortlessly, while others clung to translators by their elbows, nervous about saying the wrong thing. From her place near the back, Nia scanned the room, her trained ear picking out words from every corner. She heard a joke in Portuguese near the buffet, a whispered negotiation in Arabic by the bar, a quick exchange in Russian close to the stage. She understood them all, like snippets of music layered into one track. That's when she noticed him, Richard Hallstrom. He stood near the center, surrounded by half a dozen men who seemed to orbit him like satellites. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back neatly, his tie perfectly knotted, and his smile calculated, as if he'd practiced it in the mirror. People leaned toward him when he spoke, laughing a second too late at his jokes, nodding like every word he said carried weight. Richard was one of those men whose presence filled a room not because of warmth, but because of certainty. He walked like someone who had never been told no, and when his eyes swept across the ballroom, they landed only on those he deemed important. Nia knew the type. She'd seen men like him at court hearings and hospital board meetings, confident, dismissive, untouchable. Her stomach tightened, but she steadied herself. She hadn't come here to be intimidated. She had come to do what she did best. When the program began, Richard took the stage to welcome everyone. His voice carried easily across the ballroom, polished from years of pitching to investors. He spoke about innovation, about breaking barriers, about the future of technology. People clapped. Some even cheered. Nia listened closely, catching the irony in his words. A man praising breaking barriers, while laughing at someone like her, claiming 9 languages. After his speech, he mingled again, this time moving closer to where Nia stood. A man in a tailored navy suit leaned over and whispered to him in German. Richard chuckled, but shook his head. "Don't worry," he replied loudly in English. "Most people here can't follow that anyway." That was when Nia spoke up, without raising her voice. He said the catering was late because the chef burned a tray of duck. The men turned. Richard arched a brow, amused. "And you know that how?" Nia lifted her notebook slightly. "Because I understood him." It was the spark that lit the fire, the moment that pulled her from the shadows of the room into the center of attention. But instead of backing down, Richard leaned in with a grin, ready to test her like she was a parlor trick. And that's when the real clash began. Richard's grin widened, the kind of grin that belonged to someone who believed he held all the cards. Around him, the cluster of men chuckled as if they'd already seen how this would play out. "So you caught a little German," Richard said, swirling the glass of champagne in his hand. "Cute, but let's not get carried away." Nia's voice stayed level. It wasn't just a little, it was accurate. That confidence, wrapped in calm delivery, drew a few curious glances from nearby guests. Conversation slowed. It wasn't every day someone interrupted Richard Hallstrom. Richard turned slightly, raising his voice as if inviting the crowd into the joke. "She says she speaks 9 languages, he announced, gesturing toward Nia. 9. You believe that?" There was scattered laughter, not mean-spirited exactly, but dismissive, like the laugh people give when a magician claims he can make an elephant disappear. Nia didn't flinch. She held her ground, her notebook pressed against her side. "Then prove it," Richard said. A man with silver hair whispered something in French, a quick phrase meant to test her. Without hesitation, Nia responded, in French so smooth, so natural, that the man blinked, surprised. He nodded faintly, impressed, though he said nothing. Richard's brow lifted, but his smirk remained. He shifted gears, throwing out a question in Mandarin. Nia answered with ease, her tone crisp, her phrasing precise. Someone in the back gasped softly. He pushed again, this time in Russian, and when she answered, a woman near the buffet actually clapped. The laughter faded, the smirks disappeared. A hush began to ripple through the crowd as it became clear this wasn't a bluff. She wasn't just good, she was flawless. Richard stopped, his glass hovering in his hand. For a split second, the arrogance slipped from his face, replaced by something that looked a lot like doubt. But then it returned, stronger, almost defensive. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Parlor tricks. That's all this is. I've been to more countries than you can count. Fluency takes years, not flashcards. Nia leaned in just enough to close the space between them. Years is exactly what it took, she said softly. Years you spent chasing money while I spent chasing words. His jaw tightened. The crowd didn't hear that exchange, but they felt the tension. Eyes bounced between them like spectators at a tennis match, waiting for the next serve. Richard cleared his throat, then switched to Arabic. His accent was clumsy, but his intent was sharp. One last chance to expose her. Nia answered, not only with perfect Arabic, but with a subtle correction woven into her reply. A man standing nearby, who clearly knew the language, let out a low whistle. "She's right," he said under his breath. And then, silence. The ballroom that had moments ago been filled with laughter and chatter had gone still. People weren't eating, they weren't sipping champagne. They were watching Nia, the young woman in the plain navy dress, dismantle Richard Hallstrom's arrogance with nothing more than words. Richard's smirk faltered. His eyes darted briefly as if searching for a way out. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her. For Nia, it wasn't triumph she felt. It was something heavier, more complex. She had proven herself countless times before, but this moment was different. This wasn't just about language. It was about the room seeing her, not as a novelty, not as staff, but as someone whose presence couldn't be brushed aside. Richard finally set his glass down on the nearest table. His hand trembled slightly, though he masked it with a cough. "Impressive," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But let's not mistake talent for wisdom." The words were meant to cut, but the crowd wasn't buying it. Their silence spoke louder than applause. But silence has a way of pressing on a man's pride, and Richard wasn't finished yet. He was about to take things further than anyone expected. Richard's pride couldn't sit still in that silence. He leaned back, straightened his jacket, and gestured toward Nia like a ringmaster presenting the next act. "Fine," he said loudly, regaining his bravado. "Let's raise the stakes. If you're truly fluent, then you'll translate everything." He motioned to the floor. Guests looked around, uncertain. Then one by one, a handful of international attendees stepped forward, intrigued. A man in a dark green tie spoke rapidly in Portuguese, rattling off a sentence about the conference's schedule. Nia answered instantly, her words clean and clear. Applause rippled through the group. Next, a woman in a silk shawl whispered in Hindi, testing her with a complex idiom that often tripped up learners. Nia not only translated it, but explained the meaning with grace, her voice steady. The woman's face broke into a grin. Another man, his accent thick with Moscow roots, fired a sarcastic comment in Russian about showing off for Americans. Nia caught it and returned the remark with a playful edge in Russian that made him laugh despite himself. The tension shifted. No longer was she being mocked. It was turning into a showcase. The room leaned in, captivated, some pulling out their phones as though they'd stumbled onto the highlight of the evening. Richard's smile grew tighter with each exchange. He folded his arms, tapping his finger against his elbow, the image of a man losing control of his own stage. Then came the final blow. An older man, in a navy blazer, his accent distinctly Middle Eastern, asked a complicated question in Arabic about the future of international technology markets. It wasn't small talk. It was detailed, technical, the kind of question meant for boardrooms and policymakers. Richard raised his chin, certain this would be where she faltered. But Nia didn't falter. She didn't even blink. She translated it word for word, then elaborated, weaving the man's phrasing into perfect English, so polished that even Richard himself couldn't have answered better. Gasps echoed. The man clapped once, firmly, then said something in Arabic that needed no translation. Brilliant. That single word seemed to hang in the air, heavy and undeniable. Richard froze. His face, moments earlier smug and untouchable, went rigid. He had laughed at her. He had called her claim a trick. But now, with the entire ballroom watching, he couldn't deny what he'd seen. She wasn't just fluent. She was exceptional. His glass, abandoned earlier, still sat on the table beside him. His fingers twitched as if to reach for it, but he stopped. For the first time that night, his eyes didn't look at her as entertainment. They looked at her as a threat. And Nia knew it. She could feel the energy shift. This wasn't about languages anymore. This was about power, his pride against her presence. She stood still, chin raised, her notebook pressed calmly against her side. She wasn't smiling, wasn't gloating. She didn't need to. Her silence was stronger than words. The crowd broke into murmurs, pockets of applause, whispers traveling like sparks through dry grass. Some guests looked at Nia with awe. Others looked at Richard with quiet disappointment. One man leaned to his companion and muttered, "That girl just outclassed him in front of everyone." Richard heard it. His jaw tightened, his neck stiff. He forced a laugh, sharp and hollow. "Well, congratulations," he said, his voice louder than necessary. "You've memorized a few scripts, but understanding people, that's another matter entirely." It was a weak attempt to claw back control. Everyone could hear it. Everyone could see it. Nia finally spoke, her voice steady and even. "Languages aren't just words, Mr. Hallstrom. They're connections. And maybe that's something money can't buy." The crowd reacted, a mix of chuckles, nods, and more applause. Richard's face flushed, but he stayed silent. For a man used to controlling every conversation, silence was its own kind of defeat. But the night wasn't over, because what Richard chose to do next would change not only how people saw Nia, but how he saw himself. The applause was still echoing when Richard stepped forward, forcing a tight smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice trying to regain its smoothness, "thank you for that unexpected demonstration. Let's enjoy the rest of the evening." People slowly drifted back toward the buffet and bar, though their eyes lingered on Nia. Richard turned his back, pretending to rejoin his circle, but the mask on his face was fragile. He couldn't leave it there, not after being outshined in front of investors, partners, and journalists. A few minutes later, he found Nia near the side of the ballroom, where she stood alone with her notebook. He approached quickly, his shoes clicking against the marble floor. "You enjoy that, didn't you?" he said, voice low, sharp. Nia looked up, calm. "Enjoy what?" "Making me look like a fool." She closed her notebook gently, meeting his eyes. "I didn't make you look like anything. I just answered your questions." Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "Do you have any idea who I am? I built companies from nothing. I've sat in rooms with presidents and CEOs who can't even string together a full sentence in English, let alone another language. And you think showing off in 9 makes you special?" Nia's tone stayed even, though her chest tightened. "It's not showing off. It's my work. My life. You asked. I answered." He leaned closer, his voice dropping further. "People don't care about translators. They care about leaders, builders, people like me." For a moment, she let his words hang in the air. Then she asked quietly, "And what good is building if no one understands you?" That hit harder than he expected. His jaw flexed, but he said nothing. She went on, her voice steady but firm. "You think language is just words. It's not. It's mothers in hospitals trying to understand doctors. It's refugees in courtrooms fighting for their families. It's 2 people at a wedding who don't speak the same tongue but want to share vows. It's every person who's been ignored because no one bothered to listen. That's what I do." Richard's eyes narrowed, but there was no witty comeback this time. Just silence. He had spent years commanding rooms, bending conversations to his will. But here was a woman half his age, dressed simply, with no fortune, no name in the papers, and she had managed to turn the spotlight away from him. Something inside him twisted. Pride battled recognition. He wanted to dismiss her again, to laugh, to belittle. But the memory of the crowd's reaction, the sharpness of her answers, the way she carried herself, it all pressed against him like a weight he couldn't shake. Finally, he exhaled, his voice quieter. "You really think that matters? That anyone here will remember this tomorrow?" Nia didn't blink. "I don't need them to remember. I just need them to hear me once." For the first time that night, Richard looked at her without arrogance. His eyes softened slightly, though his pride kept the rest of his face rigid. He wasn't ready to admit it out loud, but the truth was there. She had shaken something in him. Before he could say more, a man approached, asking about an investor call. Richard waved him off, but the interruption gave him cover. He straightened his jacket and said, "Enjoy the rest of the evening," before turning away. Nia watched him go, her notebook still pressed against her side. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. But as much as Richard tried to brush it off, the echo of her words wouldn't leave him. And that's when the night took an even sharper turn. Richard spent the rest of the evening going through the motions, shaking hands, forcing laughter, posing for photos. But his mind was somewhere else. Every time he caught a glimpse of Nia at the edge of the room, quiet and steady with that notebook, her words replayed in his head. What good is building if no one understands you? When the program ended, the crowd thinned out into the hotel lobby. Some guests stopped Nia to thank her, asking questions in their native languages just to see her light up the conversation. She answered each one with the same grace as before, and more than a few handed her business cards, eager to stay in touch. Richard lingered by the exit. Pride told him to walk away, to pretend this night had been nothing more than a minor embarrassment, but something stronger pulled him back. Against his own instinct, he crossed the lobby and stopped near Nia, who was sliding her notebook into her bag. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice quieter than before. She looked up, cautious but not hostile. "Yes?" He hesitated. For a man used to quick words, the pause felt foreign. "You surprised me tonight." Nia tilted her head slightly. "You mean I didn't fit your picture of me?" His mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "Maybe. I thought languages were just, academic tricks. Useful at times, but nothing more. You made me realize they're bigger than that." She didn't let him off easy. "They've always been bigger than that. You just never had to notice." Richard exhaled, the weight of her words settling deeper. He glanced around. The lobby was nearly empty now, the hum of late-night travelers filling the space. Finally, he said, "You're right, and I owe you an apology. I laughed when I should have listened." Nia's posture softened slightly. "Apology accepted, but don't apologize to me. Apologize to yourself for how small you've been thinking." The words weren't cruel. They were sharp, yes, but honest. And for the first time in years, Richard didn't feel the urge to argue. A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with meaning. Then he cleared his throat. "You know, I have companies working overseas. I've paid consultants, hired firms, but I've never had someone like you, someone who can connect. If you're open to it, I'd like to bring you on board." Nia studied him. This was the same man who had mocked her less than an hour ago, the same man who had turned her into a punchline. Yet here he was, extending an offer. She answered carefully. "I'm not interested in being a trophy hire, Mr. Hallstrom. If I work with you, it's because you value what I bring, not because you want to polish your image." His eyes held hers, and for once there was no arrogance. "Fair," he said. "Then let's do it right." For the first time that night, Nia allowed herself a small smile. Not of victory, but of peace. Later, when she walked out into the cool Dallas night, she replayed everything in her mind. The laughter, the silence, the test, the apology. She had carried years of work on her shoulders, and tonight she proved not only to Richard, but to everyone watching, that brilliance doesn't always come dressed in wealth or status. Sometimes it comes in the form of a young woman with a worn-out notebook and relentless determination. The lesson was clear. Never underestimate someone because of how they look, where they come from, or what you assume about them. Talent, discipline, and heart can outshine arrogance every time. For Richard, the night ended with a bruise to his pride, but also the start of a shift in perspective. For Nia, it ended with proof that her sacrifices mattered, that every late night at the kitchen table, every borrowed textbook, every scribbled note had led her to this moment. And for everyone listening now, the story leaves one question hanging in the air. How many people have we overlooked because we judged before we listened? So the next time you find yourself laughing at someone's claim or doubting what they're capable of, remember Nia Caldwell. Remember the girl who spoke 9 languages and turned a room full of doubt into a room full of respect. Listen before you judge. That's the lesson. And if this story moved you, share it. Because somewhere out there, another Nia is waiting for her chance. And maybe your belief is the bridge she needs.